So here we are with the social judgment theory, and I have to tell you that I really like this theory. It's not one that I've used in my research per se, but it informs much of my thinking about persuasion. And actually, as we'll talk about, we've talked about it a little bit in this class already. But anyway, the reason I like this theory so much is that it helps me to conceptualize the sorts of messages that are really going to be most effective in persuading other people. Broadly speaking, how intense should your message be to convince somebody is an issue that, roughly speaking, this theory deals with. So that's what we're doing. And as you see, this lecture has been divided into two halves. This first half will just lay out the pieces and components of the theory, and the second half of the lecture is a series of examples that's meant to help you understand how those pieces work together better. So let us begin. Social judgment theory is developed by Shreve and Nebergall, and that name should sound familiar from the Intro to Persuasion lecture. And there we talked about them helping us to understand persuasion as a process, right? That as opposed to a single event that persuades you from one end to another, that it's step by step, right? Because or I should say little by little. Shreve and Nebergall, they don't want us to end up in a situation where you ask somebody if they support something that you believe in, and they say no, and so then you give them your best pitch about why they should really support your beliefs, and you say, do you believe, or do you agree with me now? And ask them sort of this yes or no, or do you agree with me now? It's a little like when as kids in school you passed a note, you said, do you like me? Yes or no. Because the problem is the person still may not really agree with you, not entirely, but sort of. So they didn't agree with you at all. Now they maybe agree with you, not to where you are, but maybe sort of, right? And that's what Shreve and Nebergall want to emphasize, is that persuasion really occurs as a process. And so as opposed to this yes-no orientation, we should think about an issue as, or any topic as having positions where somebody is strongly for or strongly against something. So I'm just going to give you an example. You may have somebody who is for ending all tobacco bans, whether bans based on where you can use tobacco products, that's like chew or cigarettes or cigars or what have you, right? Ending all bans on where you can use, what you can use, the age at which people can use it. I mean, they want to end all bans, right? That's one end of the continuum. And we'll really stick with maybe people who want to end bans on where you can smoke, right? So one person wants to end bans on all bans where you can smoke. So they believe that if you want to, you should be able to smoke in a kindergarten class, right? You can smoke anywhere. And someone else, or another position might be ending tobacco bans in bars, right? Because some states don't allow you to smoke in bars. Tennessee does, but some states don't allow you to smoke in a bar. And these people are saying, well, I wouldn't end bans everywhere, but maybe I would just end them in bars. And maybe somebody else says, listen, ending them in bars isn't strong enough. I would also end them in restaurants, right? But then maybe somebody else says, I would just leave things as they are. I mean, no more laws, no fewer laws, just whatever we have now is good enough. But maybe somebody else says, no, the current situation is not good. And in fact, they reject the idea of ending any sort of tobacco bans, and they want to begin taxing tobacco to discourage its use. Or they maybe want to begin fining people for smoking in public. Or at the most extreme, somebody may want to outlaw smoking altogether or outlaw all tobacco. So here we have, on this issue of tobacco use, which I'm really talking about largely here as being smoking, somebody wants, right, we have many positions. Somebody who on one end wants to end all tobacco bans, and another position that somebody else could have, which is to outlaw tobacco, and many points in between. As you look at it, you might find that you're comfortable with a couple of them, two of them that are probably next to each other, probably, right, as opposed to just a yes on all of them or no on all of them. Right? You're going to feel some place in there you're going to feel strongly about, maybe one or two, and then some others maybe you're not sure, and others you think absolutely you could never agree with. Right? We'll use a different example, and I'll go through it real quick, and then we'll talk about how this works a little bit more. This is on animal rights. I'm just choosing a topic here. So one is somebody who believes in strict vegetarianism, right? You eat no animals. Someone else says, well, you can eat a lower level animal, like a friend of mine who thinks that it's okay to eat beef but not pork because she says that she thinks that she's heard that pigs are actually pretty intelligent. So the idea is that you can eat the cow because it's dumb, but not the pig because it's smart, right? That sort of thinking. Another position a person might have is against fur, right? The killing of an animal just for its fur. Another position is a person who, saying no to fur is not enough. They would also never wear leather, right? But then you have people who say, well, I don't know, people might maybe support factory farming, which is to say these crowded spaces with lots of chickens or pigs or cows or whatever, where the animals are kept in confined spaces until they're slaughtered, right? Then you have people who are in favor of sport hunting, right, which is what I guess known as hunting, but the idea of killing an animal just for the fun of it, just for sort of mounting it on your wall. And then people who believe that animals are property. It's an object and you should be able to do with it whatever you want. So it's a whole continuum. And as you look at it, there's probably a position or two that you feel strongly for, many you would never support, and then some others you sort of waffle on. So let's play with an example, and let's say that you're against killing an animal just for its fur. I mean, and here we have the stoat, and that is wearing its winter coat. If you ever see the crowns of the British monarchs, it's trimmed in a white fur and has little black diamonds on it. That's because they're using the fur, the ermine, and that black comes from the tip of the tail. Now, some of you say it looks like a weasel, kill it. But some of you are saying, oh, look at the cute little stoat, right? So you would maintain strongly this no killing the animal for fur position. But just because you don't want to kill the animal for its fur doesn't mean that you are then going to support necessarily a sort of strict vegetarianism. In fact, it may well be that you don't support the ends, either one of these ends, right? Just because you don't want to wear fur, you also, though, you don't support strict vegetarianism, and you also, at the other end, you don't really think it's right to kill an animal just for sport, and you don't like the idea of treating animals as property where you can just do whatever you want with them, that there's no sort of humane rights to them. This should be applied to them. So you're against killing an animal for fur, right? So you feel strongly about the no fur position, but you reject this idea of I can't eat an animal, and by contrast, reject the idea of killing an animal just for the fun of it, right? So you can reject the ends and still take a piece out of the middle. But there are these other positions, now in purple, where you're just not sure. Okay, so I'm not going to kill an animal for fur, so I agree with the no fur position. I don't agree with strict vegetarianism, but I don't know how I feel about the argument that some animals are smarter and therefore deserve to live. You're like, I'm not really sure, and I'm not sure about factory farming. I guess I support it, but maybe I don't. I don't really know. Right? And so Shreve and Ebergall say this is how we are. This is who we are as humans. Things we're strongly for, strongly against, and some things we're just not sure of. And all of that, all those positions are called our latitudes. And so we have latitudes of acceptance. And the previous example, that was what was marked in yellow. The position you really knew you supported was your latitude of acceptance. It's a position you, wait for it, accept. There's latitudes of rejection. The position you just can't get behind. You reject it. And in the previous example, you rejected the ends, right? Both ends of the continuum. You just don't support it, right? Those were in the example, the ones that were in red. And then you have those you're just not sure about. It's non-commitment. You can't commit to liking it. You can't commit to hating it, which is to say, you can't commit to accepting or to rejecting. So it's your latitude of non-commitment. And in the previous example, that was marked in purple. So those are your latitudes. Now, what determines where your latitudes are going to fall? That is known as anchors. So our anchors identify our central position on the continuum, the place where we feel most strongly. The way that for a boat, an anchor is the heavy point that holds the boat down to sort of float within a general region, so to an anchor, anchors on the continuum, and we only float in the general region around that anchor. And anchors are composed of our values, our attitudes, our beliefs, right? The things we hold important, the things that we think are good or bad, and the things that we believe are true. Right? And also affecting our anchors is ego involvement. And I have an arrow next to ego involvement. And I'll talk about that arrow in a second. But ego involvement has to do with how much this issue affects us. So if we go to the first example I gave where I talked about tobacco bans, if you are a smoker, you would say are more ego involved. So you are going to feel more strongly about all these issues. I'm an employee of ETSU. So the policy that ETSU passes for its employees, I'm very interested in because I'm highly ego involved. I am not an employee at the University of Tennessee. Now I have some ego involvement because I might see those people as being my brothers and sisters in higher education. I might have some concern for them, but I don't have as much concern for them as I have for the policies at ETSU because that's what affects me most. Some of you might be you may or may not have children, and if you don't have children, you may not be as concerned about the things that affect public education, but you might some, because you might have a kid one day, so maybe you're concerned. But if you're like me and you have a small child, you're probably much more concerned about what's going on in public education and much more, at least watching it right now, and will become increasingly involved as my child goes into school. So we would say that I'm now more ego involved, and when my child enters school, I'll probably become even more ego involved, and that will make my anchor larger. So as I'm more ego involved, the anchor gets bigger, and that's what that up arrow represents. It's the as my involvement gets higher, ego involvement gets bigger. That means that my anchor gets bigger. So as one goes up, so does the other. But as we're talking about those latitudes, as I'm more ego involved, we know that I end up rejecting more positions. Because this matters more to me, I'm not open to more possibilities as an option. Because I care about it so intensely, I'm going to reject more alternate positions. Right? As I'm more ego involved, I'm going to reject more alternate positions. I have more latitudes of rejection. I hope that makes sense. It's sort of intuitive. So we take this notion of anchors, and we're going to move on to how this affects us when we hear a message. So it is called social judgment theory. So we're going to talk about judgments. I mean, it's right there in the name. It feels like you just have to do it. So judgments and ego. We're talking a little bit more about ego involvement. But first I want to talk about the judgments. So the theory says that when we hear a message, we make a judgment about it. And that judgment is whether that message is something that resonates with us, does not resonate with us, or scares the bejesus out of us. All right. So assimilation is when we hear a message and we say, yes, that sounds good. I believe that's consistent with my anchor. That's consistent with my values and attitudes and beliefs. I agree with that. You have assimilated it. And by the way, I cannot talk about assimilation without hearing about Star Trek and the Borg, and you will be assimilated, and resistance is futile. I just can't help it. But anyway, resistance is not futile here. You can resist. Right? So you might hear a message and think, yes, that's a good point. I had never considered that, but that goes right into what I already believed. So I assimilated, and now I agree with that position as well. But, as I say, resistance is not futile. I may hear a message and say, yeah, that sounds like it's too different, right? It contrasts, right? It's too different from my values, my attitudes, but beliefs, the things that are going to benefit me. And so therefore, my judgment is a contrast. I see that message as being contrasting what I believe, or opposing it, and therefore I'm going to dismiss it. I'm going to reject it right out. Right? And I want to take a moment here to emphasize that, as the book reminds you, these are perceptions. It's what you perceive as being similar to your own position or perceive as being different from your own position. It's about perception. Because sometimes we perceive a message as being really different from us, and that can create a boomerang effect. And so let's say that you think, gosh, killing an animal for fur, look at that little stoat, that little cutie. I could never kill it. So then you think, well, maybe I sort of support PETA because PETA's for ending the killing of animals for fur. And then you hear about somebody who's a PETA supporter throwing red paint on somebody for wearing fur. And you think, oh, that's crazy. That's cray-cray, right? So now that scares you, and so you're not so sure about endorsing the things that PETA endorses, and you think, well, maybe people should be allowed to wear fur because I don't want to go around throwing red paint on people. That seems like a bit much, right? It actually scares you away from your position rather than drawing you in. It is perception, because in that case, does PETA necessarily condone throwing paint on other people? I don't know that they do, but if you perceive that message as being from that group, and you perceive it as being a poor representation of what you believe, it's going to scare you away from it. It happens, by the way, I believe, with the term feminism. People believe that all feminists hate men, or that feminists hate men. I'm sure there's some feminists out there, a minority of them, who just straight up hate men. That may well be, but there's a great many feminists who, well, first off, are male, like me, or are married to men, like my wife, my partner. And so, but a person may think, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm a feminist. I support women receiving equal pay for doing the same job as a man. And then they hear about some story of feminists who hate men so much they throw rotten vegetables at them. And you think, oh, well, maybe I don't want to call myself a feminist. Maybe I shouldn't be too ardent, right? And it starts scaring you away. That's called a boomerang effect, right? Because you're trying to convince somebody of something by doing a message, by convince somebody with a message, and the message boomerangs, right? It backfires. It comes back to you, and it actually scares the person away. And we'll talk about these judgments in the example lecture. We'll go over those judgments a bit more. Now, ego involvement. I want to talk about ego involvement literally side by side with judgments. Because as we're more ego involved, see the little arrow going up there, right? As we're more ego involved, we have a tendency to skew and distort those messages. Remember, I said judgments are based on perceptions of messages, where we perceive that message falls in the continuum. And as we're more ego involved, we're more likely to skew or distort what we heard. And so we're more likely to hear something, and because we're so desperate to know and believe that other people support our cause, that we say, yes, yes, they too agree with me. Well, they don't really quite agree with you, but you are so ego involved and so need that support, you sort of, assimilate to them when maybe you shouldn't. By contrast, or I shouldn't say by contrast, I might say also, or on the other hand, a person may have a slight deviation from what you believe, right? Maybe you're very ardent, high ego involvement, and a person is suggesting a slight deviation from what you believe, but because you're so involved, you tolerate little distinction, and you think they're too far away from you, and so your judgment is a contrast, when really they're not that far away. So we say that as ego involvement goes up, you skew and distort, and that means that you actually increase contrast and assimilation, right? That arrow going up, right? So as you're more ego involved, you're more likely to see other people as contrasting you or assimilating to you. It's sort of really either end. But the point is you're so ego involved that you have more polar responses to other messages. So these are the components, really the pieces. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about how these pieces fit together and how people respond, a little bit more about how people respond to messages.